February 9th, 1887. For 23 days, the wind had relentlessly battered the wooden walls of Ashford Ridge. In this isolated collection of structures huddled against the unforgiving vastness of the Northern Territories, the final sack of wheat flour had been sold 4 weeks earlier. The merchant responsible, Ezekiel Frost, had demanded $6 silver for what had once cost merely 70 cents. The townsfolk had paid without protest, for extreme cold can make men forget the value of money when their children cry from hunger. Now even Frost's emporium stood barren, its shelves displaying only dust and the faint, lingering scent of provisions long since gone. Supply caravans from the southern routes were entombed by snowdrifts so profound that horses disappeared within them like stones dropped into water. The inhabitants of Ashford Ridge were rediscovering a truth their ancestors had known and willfully ignored, that winter in these latitudes is not merely a season, but an active force of eradication, and it was sifting them away to nothing. Yet on that frigid morning, when exhaled breath instantly transformed into tiny ice crystals, something extraordinary stirred through the piercing air. It began subtly, easily dismissed as a product of an imagination starved by hardship, but it grew in strength and clarity. The unmistakable aroma of baking bread, yeasty, warm, and utterly impossible, began to waft. Stout men paused mid-stride on the thoroughfare, tears streaming openly. Children pressed their frost-kissed faces against window panes, their gaunt eyes wide with astonishment. One by one, the starving residents of Ashford Ridge followed this sacred perfume, wading through snowdrifts that reached their waists, past the creek, frozen solid enough to support a laden cart, and up the gentle incline at the southern edge of the settlement. Their destination was the dugout dwelling of the woman they had mockingly christened Cave Woman, her name spoken with equal parts derision and commiseration. Beatrice Holloway stood at the entrance to her hillside abode, her apron dusted white with flour, clutching a golden loaf that steamed in her bare calloused hands. From a passage carved directly into the frozen earth behind her, more of that precious aroma spilled forth, like an answered supplication. The subterranean bakery, the object of their mockery for 18 months, was the sole bulwark between Ashford Ridge and widespread famine, and every individual who had scoffed at its construction now grasped the flawed logic of their error. It had commenced in the autumn of 1885, when Beatrice Holloway arrived in Ashford Ridge with her 6-year-old daughter, a borrowed mule named Steadfast, and the palpable weight of recent bereavement still settled upon her. She was 32 years old, a widow whose husband had been tragically crushed beneath a falling pine during a logging operation near the Canadian border. He had left her with $43 in actual currency, a child to raise alone, and the profound knowledge of bread making inherited from her mother, who in turn had learned it from her own mother. This culinary legacy stretched back through generations of women who understood that flour, water, and heat constituted the fundamental elements of survival. Her daughter, a small, observant child with her mother's dark hair and her father's serious gray eyes, had been named Ivy, after the plant that clings and perseveres regardless of circumstance. Before her marriage, Beatrice had been Beatrice Carver, daughter of a woman who had baked communion bread for 3 churches in the settlement of New Haven, earning just enough to sustain her family when her husband's carpentry work faltered. Beatrice had grown up understanding the complex chemistry of leavening, the essential patience required for proper fermentation, and the way good bread communicated its readiness through subtle sounds and aromas, provided the baker possessed the skill to perceive them. Her mother had imparted everything she knew, the precise ratios that could not be committed to paper but had to be instinctively felt in one's hands, the critical timing that shifted with variations in humidity and ambient temperature, the deep respect due to a sourdough starter that had been meticulously maintained for decades. When her husband passed, she had journeyed westward with Ivy, seeking a place to forge a new beginning, a locale where the past did not exert such a heavy pressure on each passing moment. Ashford Ridge seemed a suitable prospect for such fresh aspirations. It was a rough and nascent community, populated by trappers, a few cattle ranchers, and families staking claims on land grants. The settlement boasted a trading post, a rudimentary assembly hall that served a dual purpose as both a schoolhouse and a place of worship, and 2 saloons, but it notably lacked a bakery. Bread arrived in 2 primary forms. Whatever Frost could manage to transport, typically so stale that it necessitated soaking before consumption, or whatever the settler women could coax from their inadequate domestic ovens, with results ranging from barely palatable to genuinely hazardous. Beatrice perceived not only a commercial opportunity, but also a profound vulnerability that the optimistic inhabitants seemed determined to disregard. Ashford Ridge lay exposed on open terrain with minimal natural protection. There were no substantial stands of timber to provide a reliable source of fuel, and a single precarious supply line snaked southward through territory notorious for its impossible conditions. She had weathered harsh winters before, having listened to seasoned trappers speak of the unforgiving seasons with a distinct reverence that bordered on fear. Ashford Ridge was placing all its faith in the assumption that provisions would consistently arrive, that the weather would remain temperate, and that their tenuous link to civilization would remain unbroken. Beatrice, however, possessed a more discerning understanding. She knew that civilization was a transient state, and that winter acknowledged no human pacts. Her strategy materialized from practical necessity and hard-won insight. She acquired a modest parcel of land situated on a south-facing slope at the settlement's periphery. This was land that others had overlooked, deeming the soil too thin and rocky for cultivation and the incline too steep for convenient construction. She purchased it for $9, a sum that prompted open amusement from Ezekiel Frost, who effectively controlled most property transactions within the settlement. $9 for a hillside of stones, he announced to the men assembled at his mercantile. That widow has more sorrow than sense. Beatrice commenced the excavation. She labored with a short-handled spade and a pickaxe, with Ivy assisting her by gathering smaller stones into a wooden bucket that they could jointly manage. The blueprint, which Beatrice had sketched onto butcher paper during their westward journey, envisioned a chamber excavated directly into the southern slope, sufficiently capacious for a substantial masonry oven, ample storage for grain and flour, and a practical workspace. The very earth itself would provide what the exposed prairie could not: insulation from extreme temperature fluctuations, protection from the relentless wind, and the stable environment essential for baking during conditions that would render any surface operation impossible. Her mother had recounted tales of the old world bakers, families from Germany and Scandinavia, who had ingeniously integrated their ovens into hillsides and stone foundations, thereby conserving fuel and maintaining a consistent heat. Earth retains temperature, her mother had often said. An oven built into stone and soil will produce more consistently baked bread with half the firewood. It was not solely the act of baking that preoccupied her, but also the preservation of the raw materials. Flour, subjected to the wild thermal swings of a northern winter, would repeatedly freeze and thaw, its structural integrity compromised, inevitably attracting weevils. Yeast, that vital living organism upon which all leavened bread depended, would perish in severe cold. However, in the subterranean environment, where the temperature remained remarkably constant, hovering near 50 degrees, regardless of external conditions, flour would stay dry and viable, yeast cultures would persist, and bread could be produced even when the world above had entirely succumbed to ice and wind. The excavation was arduous labor for a woman working primarily alone. Yet, Beatrice was not entirely without aid. She had Ivy, small in stature but resolute, learning to interpret the land and the demands of the work. Together, they established a rhythm. Beatrice would excavate and break apart stones, while Ivy would transport the smaller pieces. Both worked in companionable silence, punctuated only by brief, functional exchanges regarding leverage points and stone placement. The soil yielded its bounty grudgingly. First, the topsoil, rich with the entwined roots of grass, followed by a layer of clay that retained moisture and required careful management to prevent structural collapse. Then came the rocky substratum, demanding the insistent application of the pickaxe and considerable physical exertion. Beatrice instructed Ivy to discern the different soil types by their color and texture, to comprehend how each would behave when wet or frozen, and to anticipate potential structural issues before they became apparent. They toiled in the early morning and late afternoon, deliberately avoiding the peak heat of autumn, and Ivy learned to wield a small hammer with proficiency, breaking apart the larger stones that her mother's pickaxe had loosened. The child's hands developed calluses. Her arms grew noticeably stronger. She learned to accurately gauge distance and trajectory, to conserve her energy over extended periods of labor, and to recognize when her mother required hydration or a moment of respite without needing to be explicitly asked. The undertaking quickly attracted attention. Initially, it was simple curiosity directed towards the widow and her peculiar child digging into a hillside with the tenacity of burrowing animals. Subsequently, it devolved into outright amusement. Ezekiel Frost, who orchestrated most social currents in Ashford Ridge, spearheaded the mockery. He was a broad-shouldered man whose countenance bore the indelible marks of whiskey and weathered exposure, having amassed a modest fortune by controlling the influx of goods into the settlement and exacting prices dictated by sheer desperation. A bakery represented a direct challenge to his monopoly on flour and baked goods, and he was determined to stifle it through derision. "Have you witnessed what that widow is undertaking up on the south slope?" he would proclaim to anyone who entered his mercantile. "Digging herself a burrow like some sort of badger, intending to bake bread underground like a cave woman. I dare say she'll be subsisting on roots and clad in animal skins by springtime." The laughter rippled through Ashford Ridge with the swiftness of an epidemic. Soon, Beatrice's endeavor had acquired an appellation, the Cave Woman's Den. Uttered with disdain and feigned sympathy, the few women residing in the settlement offered no greater kindness. Sarah Frost, the merchant's wife, made a deliberate point of excluding Beatrice from every social engagement, every quilting circle, and every shared Sunday repast following services. "We must exercise caution," she would explain to the other women with an affectation of concern. "The poor woman is clearly not in her right mind, digging in the dirt with her child no less. It's unseemly and potentially hazardous." Through it all, Beatrice continued to dig deeper. Ivy worked alongside her mother without complaint, learning to fit stones together, mastering the art of mixing mortar from lime and sand, and understanding that the opinions of others held no weight against the inexorable certainty of the approaching winter. By the conclusion of October, the primary chamber was completed. It extended 14 feet into the hillside, measured 16 feet in width, and possessed a height of 9 feet from its compacted earth floor to the apex of its gently arched ceiling. Beatrice had reinforced every surface with stones meticulously hauled from a dry creek bed situated 2 miles distant. She fitted them together with mortar, which she mixed in small batches, imparting to Ivy the correct ratios by tactile feel and consistency rather than by precise measurement. The ceiling arch, while not aesthetically refined, was structurally sound and adequately angled to channel away any moisture that might inadvertently seep through. The brick oven represented her masterpiece and her most significant expenditure. She had procured the fire bricks from a kiln operation situated 3 days' travel to the south, expending nearly all her remaining funds to have them transported north by wagon. The oven was integrated into the rear wall of the chamber, its substantial mass engineered to absorb heat from a small, sustained fire and radiate it evenly for many hours afterwards. Its construction demanded absolute precision. Each fire brick had to be laid perfectly level. The mortar joints had to be exact, and the interior dome had to curve according to principles Beatrice had absorbed from her mother, who had in turn learned them from master bakers in their ancestral homeland. The oven's opening was meticulously sized to facilitate an appropriate draft while retaining maximum heat. The internal chamber was shaped to promote uniform air circulation, ensuring that loaves placed at the rear would bake at the same rate as those positioned near the front. Beatrice worked with deliberate slowness, verifying the levelness of each brick with a length of string and a plumb bob she had fashioned from a stone and twine. Ivy meticulously mixed mortar in small batches, grasping the correct ratio of lime to sand to water by observing how the mixture behaved when stirred, how it should hold its form while remaining workable. The child learned to interpret her mother's hand signals, passing tools and materials without verbal communication, cultivating the silent rapport of seasoned laborers. A stone chimney, carefully angled to create a draft without permitting cold air to cascade back down, vented smoke up through the hillside, emerging 20 feet from the entrance. The construction of the chimney alone required 5 days. Each stone was selected for its size and shape, fitted together to form a passage that would withstand decades of heating and cooling cycles without succumbing to cracking or collapse. She installed robust pine shelving for flour storage, shelves that Ivy helped to sand smooth, preventing splinters from snagging the grain sacks. She fashioned bins lined with hammered tin to deter moisture and vermin, instructing Ivy on how to meticulously check the seals by candlelight, searching for any discernible gaps. In a small alcove near the oven, where the temperature remained warmest and most stable, she placed a ceramic crock containing her most prized possession, her mother's sourdough starter. This starter had been meticulously nurtured for over 40 years, sustained through periods of both poverty and prosperity across 3 different states and territories, through seasons of abundance and seasons of near starvation. It represented more than mere flour and water and wild yeast. It embodied continuity, familial heritage, and tangible proof that life could persevere through any adversity if properly tended. Beatrice replenished it with religious regularity, teaching Ivy the prescribed routine, the characteristic scent of healthy fermentation, and the subtle way it should bubble and rise when fed. "This is our foundation," she impressed upon her daughter. "Everything else we can replace, but this we must safeguard." Ivy understood, with the innate comprehension children possess for matters of profound importance, and embraced her role as assistant starter keeper with unwavering seriousness. The total outlay for the underground bakery, encompassing the land purchase materials, the invaluable fire bricks, and the tin for the storage bins, amounted to $61. When she commenced operations in November of 1885, she priced her loaves at 8 cents each, less than half the sum Frost demanded for his commercially compromised imports. The bread was exquisite, imbued with the profound complexity of prolonged fermentation, boasting a crisp, golden crust and a tender, aromatic interior. It was unlike anything the residents of Ashford Ridge had ever encountered, and word of its exceptional quality spread, transcending the social stigma attached to its origins. Families began making the pilgrimage to the Cave Woman's Den, returning with loaves that their neighbors observed with a mixture of envy and bewilderment. Frost was deeply displeased. He initiated the dissemination of rumors suggesting that underground baking was inherently unwholesome, that bread produced in a subterranean environment was likely contaminated with soil and possibly afflicted with disease. He loudly insinuated that no Christian household should partake of sustenance originating from a hole in the ground, implying, without direct assertion, that the entire endeavor possessed an unnatural, even pagan, quality. He exerted pressure upon the settlement's informal council to conduct an inspection of the premises, harboring the hope that they would discover some infraction that would necessitate its closure. However, the inspection, carried out by 3 visibly uncomfortable men who clearly wished to be elsewhere, revealed no grounds for complaint. The underground bakery was demonstrably cleaner than most kitchens in Ashford Ridge. The temperature within was cool and remarkably stable. There were no signs of insects, rodents, mold, or standing water. The makeshift council, despite their diligent search for justification to shut down an operation that caused them social discomfort, found none. Nevertheless, the social isolation persisted. Beatrice was tolerated as a commercial necessity, but remained excluded from the broader community life. She baked her bread, tended her starter, raised her daughter, and maintained her own council. She had no companions in Ashford Ridge apart from Ivy and Steadfast the mule. Yet she possessed her work and an unwavering certainty about the impending hardships. The initial winter, spanning 1885 to 1886, proved manageable. The supply wagons operated intermittently, provisions arrived in sufficient quantities, and Ashford Ridge congratulated itself on its resilience and good fortune. Beatrice meticulously observed the prevailing weather patterns, shared her insights with no one, and continued her preparations. In the early spring, she purchased additional grain directly from a passing farmer, storing it in her underground bins, while others were freely spending on luxuries freighted from the south. She stockpiled firewood, cutting and splitting it, and neatly stacking it in a shed constructed against the hillside near the bakery entrance. She was not merely preparing for that particular winter, she was fortifying herself for the one that would inevitably follow. The summer of 1886 was characterized by intense heat and an unusually prolonged dry spell. The wheat harvest failed across the entirety of the Northern Territory, leading to a corresponding surge in grain prices. Frost, ever the astute opportunist, acquired the limited supplies that reached Ashford Ridge and promptly doubled his prices. Beatrice, having secured her own provisions at earlier, more reasonable rates, maintained her bread prices at 8 cents, and on occasion gifted loaves to families she knew were experiencing hardship, expecting no remuneration in return. Frost's simmering resentment solidified into active animosity. He began to refuse her any supplies whatsoever, compelling her to conduct her trade with itinerant farmers and trappers, a situation she accepted without complaint. The advent of autumn brought omens that deeply unsettled Beatrice. The geese departed for their southern migration nearly 3 weeks earlier than usual, their formations so immense they cast the sky into darkness for hours. The squirrels and chipmunks exhibited an uncharacteristic frenetic energy, amassing provisions with unusual urgency. The woolly caterpillars she encountered were entirely black, an ancient meteorological indicator that her mother had instilled in her to respect. An aged trapper named Dugan, who had survived in the territories for 40 years, confided in anyone willing to listen that a catastrophic winter was on the horizon, the kind that descended only once in a generation. No one heeded his warnings. They dismissed him as senile and disregarded his dire pronouncements. In mid-October, Beatrice tripled her firewood reserves, working in tandem with Ivy to stack cord after cord against the hillside. She purchased an additional 300 pounds of flour from a freight wagon, returning southward, paying cash when others were procuring on credit, fully expecting to settle their debts at a later, unspecified date. She meticulously checked and rechecked her stores, her starter, and her oven, instructing Ivy in every facet of their operational systems. Steadfast was relocated to a small stable she had excavated adjacent to the bakery, connected by a short passageway, ensuring the mule would have shelter, warmth, and companionship throughout whatever was to come. November heralded snowfall of significant intensity that refused to recede. December proved to be exceptionally harsh. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero and remained there for extended periods. The wind howled incessantly, generating drifts that engulfed entire structures and rendered travel between buildings genuinely perilous. The supply wagons, which had been operating on a reduced schedule, ceased their journeys entirely, following a blizzard in mid-December, which buried the southern route under snow measured in yards rather than feet. Ashford Ridge found itself utterly cut off. Initially, there was no widespread panic. Families had prudently laid in supplies. They possessed preserved meats and smokehouses. Christmas was observed quietly, but without overt desperation. However, as January progressed relentlessly and the temperature steadfastly refused to rise, while the snow continued to fall unabated, reality descended like a debilitating illness. The flour reserves were dwindling. The preserved meats were entirely consumed. The stored root vegetables were exhausted. Families who had never experienced true hunger began to comprehend its peculiar and insidious cruelty. Frost's Mercantile became the focal point of daily gatherings, met with daily disappointment. Each morning, a small throng would congregate, harboring hopes for news of arriving wagons, clinging to the possibility of some miraculous intervention. Each morning, they dispersed with nothing. Frost, who had amassed the largest private hoard of supplies within the settlement, commenced selling at prices that bordered on outright extortion. $2 for a cup of flour, $3 for a handful of dried beans. The populace paid because the alternative was witnessing their offspring perish from hunger. By the commencement of February, even Frost's financial reserves had been exhausted. His commercial premises stood devoid of goods, and the individual who had previously commanded Ashford Ridge through trade now possessed nothing to vend. The entire community faced starvation. Throughout this period of widespread suffering, Beatrice Holloway continued her diligent baking. The subterranean bakery, a space excavated into the frost-laden hillside, maintained a consistent temperature of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The flour stored within its tinned compartments remained dry and viable. The sourdough starter, nurtured daily by Beatrice with ivy, observing and absorbing each step, effervesced with vibrant life in its sheltered nook. The brick oven, fueled by the diligently stockpiled firewood, generated a dependable uniform heat. Each morning, prior to the first light of dawn, Beatrice would descend into her workspace with Ivy accompanying her, and together they would execute the time-honored process. This involved combining the preferment, allowing it to ferment, incorporating the dough, meticulously kneading it to a smooth consistency, shaping the resultant loaves, permitting them to proof until adequately risen, carefully loading the oven, and then vigilantly monitoring the baking. The final loaves were extracted at the exact moment when the crust and interior had achieved peak perfection. This daily ritual evolved into a form of meditative practice. Ivy acquired the skill to gauge the dough's readiness by gently pressing it with a finger, observing the speed at which it regained its shape. She learned to estimate the oven's temperature by holding her hand near the opening and counting the seconds before the heat became unbearable. She developed the ability to discern the precise instant when the bread was fully baked by the resonant sound it produced when tapped on its bottom crust, a hollow echo that signified the formation of a proper internal structure. They labored by the glow of lamplight, the underground chamber radiating warmth, while the world above succumbed to gloom and mortality. The physical separation from the dying settlement overhead imparted a peculiar serenity to their endeavors. They could discern the wind's fierce howl past the chimney's aperture and feel the structure subtly vibrate during the most intense gusts, yet within, the temperature remained steady. Their work persisted, and the bread continued to rise, unswayed by the winter's demands. For several weeks, Beatrice had been discreetly delivering bread to those she knew were enduring the most acute hardship. This included the Callahan family, whose patriarch had tragically perished from the cold while checking his trap lines in December. It also encompassed the elderly Hendersons, who lacked any assistance and were too proud to seek it. Furthermore, it extended to a young couple with 3 small children who had arrived in autumn with virtually nothing. She sought no remuneration and accepted no expressions of gratitude. She simply placed the loaves at their doorsteps before daybreak, enveloped in clean fabric and still radiating warmth, serving as tangible proof that someone remembered their existence. On the 9th of February, the wind finally veered, and for the first time in weeks, the atmosphere was tranquil enough to carry scents across significant distances. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through Ashford Ridge, resembling a benevolent visitation from a more clement world. They converged in a disheveled procession, advancing slowly through snow that reached their thighs. Frost led the vanguard, though he lingered behind as they approached, his ingrained pride yielding to the gnawing pangs of hunger. Among them were the informal council members, men who had previously scrutinized her bakery, seeking justifications to shut it down, and who now approached with supplications for its output. Sarah Frost clutched her shawl tightly, her gaze fixed firmly upon the ground. Beatrice stood at the threshold of her subterranean bakery, Ivy by her side, cradling a freshly baked loaf in her hands, which bore faint traces of flour. Behind them, the passage into the hillside was illuminated by lamplight and radiated warmth. She regarded the individuals who had derisively labeled her a cave woman, who had ostracized her daughter from their children's games, and who had rendered her an object of both mockery and pity. She observed their emaciated visages and desperate eyes, and beneath that desperation she perceived something more profound. She recognized fellow residents who perhaps could yet embrace the true meaning of community. "Enter," she stated plainly. "There is sufficient bread for all." They filed into the chamber they had once disparaged, descending into what they had pejoratively termed the cave woman's den. Within, they discovered not darkness and destitution, but an environment of order, warmth, and the sacred fragrance of freshly baked bread. Loaves were neatly arranged on the shelves, and others awaited baking. The oven emitted a gentle heat. Steadfast, their animal companion emitted soft sounds from the adjacent stable. Ivy remained close to her mother, her expression watchful and serious, a child who had comprehended that adults could be prone to folly but were occasionally capable of learning. The townsfolk moved deliberately through the space, their hands tracing the stone walls they had previously ridiculed, examining the shelving they had dismissed as madness, and beginning to grasp for the first time the ingenuity of Beatrice's creation. The ambient temperature was comfortable, almost balmy compared to the lethal chill outside. The air was perfumed with the mingled scents of yeast, wood smoke, and baked grain. Several individuals wept openly, not solely from the pangs of hunger, but from a dawning recognition of their own profound short-sightedness. They had scorned brilliance because its manifestation was unfamiliar. They had derided foresight because it challenged their entrenched assumptions. They had deliberately excluded a woman and child who had endeavored to safeguard them from their own destructive impulses. Frost was the last to enter. He stood before Beatrice, a man whose foundational certainties had crumbled. His amassed wealth had proven utterly meaningless. His former influence had vanished. His past unkindness had returned to him in the form of deep remorse. He opened his mouth, but initially no sound emerged. Beatrice extended a loaf, still warm from the oven, to him. "Consume, Mr. Frost," she said softly. "Bread is intended to sustain life, not to inflict punishment." He accepted it with hands that trembled, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming weight of his self-realization. For a considerable duration, he simply held the loaf, absorbing its warmth and inhaling its comforting aroma. Then, in a voice barely audible, he spoke. "I ridiculed you," he confessed. "I labeled you cave woman. I attempted to sabotage your enterprise and your reputation. I incited this entire settlement against you. And you?" He faltered, unable to articulate further. "I baked bread," Beatrice replied. "That is my singular skill. The rest of it, the animosity, the exclusion, that belongs to the past. Today, we nourish ourselves. Tomorrow, we embark on a new beginning." The bread from that arduous winter became an integral element of Ashford Ridge's historical account. Beatrice continued to bake daily, providing sustenance to anyone who approached her dwelling. She requested no payment, although many insisted on offering whatever meager possessions they could spare, a promissory note, a piece of adornment, a pledge of future labor. When spring finally arrived, and the thaw commenced in late March, allowing the initial supply wagon to traverse the sodden terrain from the south, Ashford Ridge had lost merely 2 individuals to the winter's ravages, both elderly and already in frail health prior to the onset of the cold. This outcome was nothing short of extraordinary. Other communities within the region had been decimated. Entire families had been wiped out. Settlements had simply ceased to exist. Ashford Ridge, however, endured because a woman they had branded a cave woman had produced bread from a subterranean refuge and had made the compassionate choice to share it with those who had offered her nothing but disdain. The account of this period was formally presented in early April at a communal gathering convened in the rudimentary hall that served multiple purposes. Every adult capable of walking was in attendance. Ezekiel Frost stood before the assembled group, a man visibly humbled by the winter's hardships and his own profound shame. He addressed them without his characteristic bravado, his voice steady but devoid of its former arrogance. "This community owes its very survival to one individual," he declared. "A woman we mocked, a woman we ostracized, a woman who, when we possessed nothing and deserved even less, bestowed upon us everything." He then turned towards Beatrice, who was seated towards the rear with Ivy beside her. "Mrs. Holloway," he continued, "I speak on my own behalf, and I believe I speak for all of us when I say that we were wrong, profoundly and disgracefully wrong, and we are indebted to you beyond any measure of words I can express." Others followed suit. Sarah Frost rose and publicly apologized for the social exclusion, for the cruel epithets, and for instructing her children to shun Ivy as if the child were afflicted with a contagious disease. The council members admitted their failure to recognize wisdom when it was presented to them. One by one, the residents of Ashford Ridge confessed their lack of perception and conveyed their heartfelt gratitude, with Beatrice accepting each declaration with quiet dignity, neither gloating nor downplaying the significance of what had transpired. Finally, she stood, with Ivy by her side. "My mother often said that bread is the most ancient form of kindness," Beatrice stated. "It is flour, water, and time, transformed by heat into something that sustains life. It demands nothing from the person who consumes it. It passes no judgment. It simply nourishes." She surveyed the faces in the room, faces that had once averted their gaze but now turned towards her with an air bordering on profound respect. "I will impart my knowledge to anyone who wishes to learn," she announced. "Not because you have earned this instruction, but because knowledge, much like bread, is meant to be disseminated, and because my daughter is learning that while the world can be a harsh place, we are not obligated to be so ourselves." That summer, 4 additional subterranean bakehouses were excavated into the hillside surrounding Ashford Ridge, each constructed under Beatrice's meticulous guidance. She instructed both the women and several of the men in the fundamental principles of sourdough preparation, bestowing upon each new bakery a portion of her mother's starter, a living culture that served as a tangible link to their ancestral homeland, to ancient wisdom, and to the understanding that had safeguarded her lineage. The phrase, "digging a holloway," subsequently entered the local lexicon. It came to signify the act of preparing for foreseeable calamities that others chose to ignore, and of constructing systems that remained beyond the comprehension of most. The expression was uttered with a palpable sense of admiration. Ezekiel Frost divested himself of his mercantile establishment in the year 1888. He had suffered too significant a financial and moral decline to continue in the realm of commerce. However, he discovered a renewed sense of purpose. He became Beatrice's apprentice, embarking on the arduous journey of learning the baker's craft at the advanced age of 54. He never attained mastery of the trade. His hands were too coarse and his patience too limited. Nevertheless, he found a measure of peace in the labor itself, in the simple, repetitive rhythm of flour, water, and fire, and in the profound realization that he was finally contributing something tangible to the world rather than merely extracting profit. Beatrice Holloway lived to the venerable age of 79, passing away peacefully in the autumn of 1934. Ivy, now grown and with children of her own, was present at her mother's side during her final moments. The funeral ceremony proved to be the most expansive Ashford Ridge had ever witnessed. Her underground bakery remains standing to this day, meticulously preserved as a historical artifact. Visitors descend into that cool, somber chamber, endeavoring to comprehend its profound significance. The lingering scent of bread emanating from the frozen earth evokes a sense of a small miracle that sustained life when the world above had become uninhabitable. Adorning the wall, an inscription carved long ago reads, "Bread is the oldest kindness."